So now it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Laura Jones. Laura is going to talk about the mysteries and discoveries along Old Page Mill Road. I hike and take my bike up and down Old Page Mill Road all the time. And I don't know if they're still there. There used to be goats at the end of the road. I love the goats. Laura is the university archaeologist at Stanford University, and she's also the president of the Stanford Historical Society. During her career, Dr. Jones has collaborated with the Muwekma, close enough, Ohlone tribe, to excavate, record, and rebury the skeletal remains of their ancestors. As Stanford's university archaeologist, she has been recognized for her work overseeing the excavation of the men's gymnasium, the repair of the Angel of Grief, and the restorations of both the Arizona Cactus Garden and the Stanford Family Mausoleum. She currently serves as president of the Stanford Historical Society. So please welcome Dr. Laura Jones.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you today to talk about a current project. This is work in progress along Old Page Mill Road. And there are mysteries and surprises and occasions in which I make silly mistakes, and then I don't find what I'm looking for, and then I find something else. So it's the archaeologist's journey along Old Page Mill Road. Why did we go to Old Page Mill Road to do a project? The map that you see up there is the Stanford University Habitat Conservation Plan Matadero Deer Creek Basin, which is a bureaucratic way to say that there are endangered species living in Matadero Creek along Old Page Mill Road, the California red-legged frog. And so those pink snaky things on the map, Matadero and Deer Creek, were dedicated in a permanent conservation easement to protect these frogs and their breeding habitat. My colleague at Stanford, Dr. Alan Lawner, did this important work with the Habitat Conservation Plan, and he told me that they were really interested in doing some improvements up on the banks next to the creek so that when the water is flowing really fast, like it did last week, the frogs could get out of the water and hide somewhere damp and not get flushed down the channel to the bay. And so he wanted to do ponds and little wetland marshes above the bank. This is sort of terrifying to an archaeologist, the idea that you're going to dig a bunch of pits next to the creek, because that is in fact where the ancient Ohlone people lived. So I said, we really need to check this out before you get started with any plans for these frogs. So my goals were to identify archaeological resources to support the Habitat Conservation Plan. If it's good for the frogs, that makes me happy too. And because we're a university, to provide educational opportunities during that effort, both for Stanford undergraduates, for high school students, for other people who work for us. And I count this as an educational opportunity as well to share this with you here in Palo Alto. So that's why we were over there on Old Page Mill Road. What we were looking for, and I'm sorry, I left the Ohlone sites off the top of this list because I didn't find any, so I forgot. I went there looking for that. It wasn't there. And we can talk more about that in the question session if you like. The other things that I knew I was looking for at the beginning of the project, this started last spring quarter with a class I teach at Stanford in archaeological field survey technique. I was looking for some sites associated with the World War I Army camp, Camp Fremont. Raise your hand if you've heard of Camp Fremont. Okay, good. I don't have to tell you much about that. This is the Camp Fremont soldiers assaulting the hill. It was my metaphor for the archaeologists assaulting the problem of what's out there at Old Page Mill. We were looking for a branch jail, more about that, and some mystery buildings from some old maps. Those were our objectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that in archaeology, which is a little bit different than how historians work. We start, of course, in historical archaeology with archival research. And what you see in front of you, this beautiful watercolor map, is from the Stanford Geological Survey. So the Stanford geology classes used to send their students out into the field, and they had to learn how to draw maps, how to take measurements, how to draw maps. And this map from Robert Snodgrass is from 1900. These are incidentally available online if you search for Stanford Geological Survey. What's important about the map, and then we'll get back to the methods in a minute, is to look at that kind of, on the screen it looks kind of pinkish orange blob coming over here. Page Mill Road is the straight line that starts in that upper corner and comes down. That's the current Page Mill Road, and then snakes along the creek. So Old Page Mill Road is on the far side of Mr. Snodgrass's watercolor area. So that red will become important later. The other thing to notice about it, if you can see it, this is why I told some of you to sit up front, is that there what looks like, through my trifocals, salt and pepper scattered at the bottom of that map in the black and white section, and up at the front, these little squares are buildings. We called them the mystery buildings because we're not sure what they were for. So we start with archival research. We looked at over 50 historic maps that included the Old Page Mill Road area. I just picked the prettiest one to show you today. And then we conduct surface reconnaissance. Surface reconnaissance is a fancy term for walking around looking at the ground. All archaeologists do this. When I walk with Mike and we go for a hike, he's looking at airplanes, he's looking at birds. I'm going like this. It is a habit that's hard to break. Walking around. Hopefully walking around informed by your research to see whether or not you can find anything on the surface. We're going to talk a little bit about remote sensing, which are tools that allow you to see under the ground. And then, obviously, archaeologists excavate. We'll talk about that. And then we analyze what we found in artifact analysis. We'll talk about all of these things, actually, today. So the first survey objective, Camp Fremont. Camp Fremont, and I apologize that this is the best map of Camp Fremont that exists. The Camp Fremont practice ground and rifle range were located near Old Page Mill Road. So Camp Fremont, 30,000 troops, about 6,000 acres, base headquarters in Menlo Park, as you all know, but over in the area of Old Page Mill Road and the Stanford Research Park, they had a rifle range and a maneuver ground. Here are their cannons, their artillery, parked up by the Stanford Dish foothills, firing off towards Foothill Park. Camp Fremont was a very big installation, and we've been looking for archaeological features associated with it across the Stanford foothills. This is what surface reconnaissance looks like. This is my spring quarter class of undergraduates with their metal detectors, which is a type of sort of primitive remote sensing, sees about 6 to 8 inches in the ground, picks up metal. So they're looking for metal remains of Camp Fremont. I have to say that they don't work very well in the rain, one thing we discovered. But we're out, we're looking for Camp Fremont. We found thousands of bullets, and rifle casings and pistol casings. During the middle of our class session, a construction project hit a grenade over on Porter Drive in the research park, and people got really nervous at Stanford about what we were doing with the metal detectors. The grenade did not explode, more about that later, but we did pick up thousands of bullet casings. And we discovered the remains of trenches. So there's a diagram of trench warfare. Trench warfare practiced extensively in World War I, less so since then. But along Matadero Creek, we did find a complex of very well-preserved trenches. The lavender color are the holes, or the trench, and the pink are the abutments. The spoils of those trenches are piled up in front of the trench, both to protect the people in the trench and also that they could put their rifles on it when they fired to rest the rifle. So we found a trench complex. We were very excited about the trench complex. Talk more about that in a minute. Surprise number 1 comes in. The shooting didn't stop in 1918. So my students and I were doing archival research. We were looking for information about Camp Fremont, and we discovered that the Palo Alto Gun Club and the Stanford Rifle Club both used the Camp Fremont rifle range. And they used it from 1927 till 1948. So some of those thousands and thousands and thousands of bullets come from this activity. The running deer target, I don't even know who runs the deer. I was trying to figure out, the deer will be run. I mean, who runs the deer? Would you run that deer? I wouldn't run that deer. Well, they were shooting at it. They had bear targets and turkey targets and the traditional skeet shooting clay target. But they did this for 20 years out there on Old Page Mill Road. And then, just to make it even more complicated, surprise number 2, there was a World War II Army camp. And the aerial photo, the Quonset huts are up there. That is the brand new Foothill Expressway, and right above it, where you see all that disturbed sort of rectangle, that is the Page Mill Army Camp. And then they drove across the creek, and their maneuver grounds were down here closer to Old Page Mill Road. 24 barracks and 5 mess halls, squads of light and heavy machine guns, an anti-tank squad, mortar squads, and they were going to break the U.S. Army speed record for going into action. So imagine this further complicating this problem about the ammunition casings. Well, what did we find out in artifact analysis? I have some really smart people who work for me, and what we discovered is that shell casings have a stamp on the bottom. It's called a head stamp. You'll see it over there on the side. And they're not all as clearly dated. That one says 1944. They're not all as clearly dated as this one. They're codes stamped into the bottom of those casings. They all include a date. So if we went back to the trenches that we were so excited about, because I assumed that trenches meant World War I, the trenches are World War II. So the casings are from the 1940s, including, strangely enough, casings from French manufactured machine guns. Who knows what they're doing over there, but they have French machine guns. So that was one surprise, one case in which all of my assumptions turned out to be incorrect, but where artifact analysis saved me in the end. We have thousands of these, so we're still entering data and reading head stamps about this, but it amazed me that you were able to learn that. One thing I have learned as an archaeologist, by the way, is that people will collect anything, and collectors will amass information about their passion, and they used to publish little collector's guides, little booklets. Now they have websites. I have won many bets with people who said, oh, you could never find that out. There's a spark plug collector society. When we found these bullet casings, I said, I bet if you look on the web, we can figure that out. And I was, in fact, correct, although we did order 6 books about cartridge casings, by the way. Military history, really important. Really important now in the centennial of the end of World War I, and there's a huge amount of material out there about it. Okay, another case in which the survey objective, the branch jail, I also made some mistaken assumptions. So we had these maps, a 1908 map, branch jail, and a 1978 map where the jail is down there in the corner next to the quarry. And I spent weeks thinking that this was the Mayfield jail. Right? This turns out to be completely untrue. I couldn't figure out who else's jail it was, right? It's next to Mayfield, it must be the Mayfield jail. I spent a lot of time reading crime in Palo Alto from the 19th century, trying to figure out some clue about that jail. There was something just staring me right there in the face, which is that the jail and the quarry go together, right? There they are on the map. Quarry, jail, branch, jail, quarry. They used prison gang labor at the quarry. So it was a county jail. So Santa Clara County in 1905 wanted to pave El Camino Real, and they needed rock. And that pinkish orange blob on the watercolor map is basalt, which is used in crushed rock road base. So they rented or leased land from Stanford, and they built that quarry for crushed rock to pave El Camino Real. And they operated that quarry with prison labor. So if you got, and they were particularly proud of how they were going to use hobos to do it. What you see on the right is if you're a hobo and you get caught in Palo Alto, you're going to the Waldorf, all right? If you're a hobo and you get caught in San Jose, you're coming to the rock quarry, all right? That was one of my Palo Alto, Mayfield jail articles that I found. With the new jail deluxe, when the overindulgent tramp sunk in slumber is gently deposited in the local caboose, he will awake to feast his eyes on the bewildering palatiality. All right? And the jail, I have to say the jail at the rock quarry, on the other hand, had no windows and no ventilation. What a horrible, it's just a horrible, horrible thing. So we went out to look for the jail. We were very interested in the jail, interested in this question about what would a branch jail look like in 1905 in sort of frontier California. We had done the archival research. We zeroed in on this little patch in between some trees out there on the side of the road. And we didn't find a thing. We had the metal detector. We went out there. We spent, my class, 10 people, spent, maybe 40 hours on this little patch. This is a patch of grass about half the size of this room. We couldn't find the jail. So we then went to a geotechnical consultant who did remote sensing for us. So they drove these machines on carts across that dirt patch there. And they did terrain conductivity, where they found this red blob that turned out to be a manhole cover for a water line. That was not interesting. But the pink total magnetivity map on the right side, this pink lozenge up there at the top, we went to the next method, excavation. We threw a test pit in there, 1 by 1 meter test pit. Science takes place in the metric system. And lo and behold, we have this giant piece of redwood on top of a piece of a concrete sill. We're very excited about that. This is last summer. And we discovered that we had the branch jail footings. Now, at first, we were a little perplexed. That first thing that we found, which is in the upper part there, is actually an 8-foot thick concrete wall. All right, with redwood, the redwood board forms on the inside would have been the inside of the jail. It was on a 6-foot thick deep concrete foundation, and then the inside floor was filled with cobbles bigger than your head. And the roof, the sheet metal roofing, was then they tied metal straps and screwed them into the joist so the prisoners couldn't break out of the top of the roof of the jail. In fact, one of the walls of the jail, so sad, we found this little patch where somebody had carved through the 4-inch thick redwood and then tried to chip into that concrete to try to break out of that jail. We did find a building a branch jail manual from 1900 that suggested this kind of technique for keeping your prisoners in the jail. So these are, in fact, the footings of the branch jail. And we're not really sure. There's still some mysteries involved here. There's a huge iron pipe coming out from the side of that jail. I mean, it has to be 2 feet in diameter. What is that thing? I mean, you could have escaped through the pipe. I don't really know yet where it's going. It could have been a stove vent or something on top of the roof that just fell over when they demolished the jail. So this is the first step. We found the jail footings. We would really like to find, and we'll talk some more about that later, the kitchen trash from the jail, the outhouse from the jail full of treasure. We would like to know more about the lives of these prisoners. They were all men, the lives of these men, while they were working in the quarry. Labor laws change in California in about 1910 to 1912. There's a big reform about what you can do, both in prisons and in labor camps. The sanitation you have to have, how often you have to feed people, how many rest breaks they have to have. And so anytime we have one of these sites in California that dates before the reform era, it's very interesting to see if all the things the reformers were saying were going wrong are really true. And looking at how hard they were trying to keep hobos in this jail, I'm afraid they might be. So our next survey objective was the mystery buildings along Old Page Mill Road. And so we started off on those little building sites up and down the road, walking around on the surface, and we did eventually find some historical artifacts on the surface. But what we found were domestic trash dumps that weren't located next to the building sites. They weren't where I expected them to be. There are surprises sometimes, and I'll tell you what I think this is. You can see there's a tin can and a fork sticking out under the root, and some china, and some burned animal bone, and a lot of other stuff in this test pit. These are some of the items that came out of that pit. And we're doing some we're doing the archival research and the artifact research to date these. But they date from about 1850 to about 1910. The other thing that's important to notice about them is the toys. So there's a doll and a little china teacup and the marbles, which strongly suggest that there were families there. This is at some distance, by the way, from the jail. So we don't think this has anything to do with the jail. It has to do with people throwing their trash away, families. So whose trash was it? And I just happen to love this 1930 map of Palo Alto where the Stanford Quad is the center of the universe. And as I said, I looked at a lot of historic maps, and you'll see for some reason I don't really understand that the 2 parcels that are outlined in the zoom in, which if you drive up Old Page Mill Road, right about the time that you get to the Frenchman's Tower, on the other side of the street, there are houses up there, right? That's not Stanford land. It's never been Stanford land. There's houses up there. And those houses are on these 2 parcels, the Murphy parcels. These were Murphys. The Murphy family was in the first wagon train to cross the Sierra, 23 Murphys. More about that later. They were the people who rescued the Donner Party, this wagon train. They were friends of John Sutter and had a head start on the gold rush and became fabulously rich. They founded Sunnyvale, San Martin, and Murphy's. They founded Santa Clara University. They founded Notre Dame de Namur University. So very important local pioneer family, California family, the Murphys. You notice that there are 23 of them just on the wagon train. Try to imagine how many there are 2 generations later. Though, and let me just say something about the Murphys. I didn't include all these slides because we're still teasing it out. The Murphys' property was next. There's a corner up there, and one of the reasons the tower is there is that it marks the corner of Peter Coots's property. Okay, so that's the corner of Peter Coots's property. The Murphys are right across the road, and on the other side of them is some property that belonged to a man named Lieb. He's another long story. It's an Arastradero Road story with another murder you invite me back, okay, because I'm not talking about it today. But it's this strange area up there where you have these 3 parcels that come together. And in fact, there are also 3 different Spanish land grants that come together. And so it may not have been entirely clear to the Murphys where exactly their property ended, because they were walking a couple hundred feet onto somebody else's property and dumping their trash. That's as charitable as I can be about it. But it's entirely possible that that is, in fact, what they were doing, was that they were just walking over to the fence and throwing the trash over the other side. But when I say it's never that easy, we also went up to the tower, and it's really hard to see on this map, but right along the road, going up this way, sideways, it says Old Tunnel. Boy, were we excited about the Old Tunnel. So Peter Coots was digging a tunnel through the hill because he wanted to take the water out of Matadero Creek and pipe it through to Frenchman's Lake. The lake's been filled in, Frenchman's Park in the Stanford faculty housing area, and to water the cows for his dairy. And Peter Coots had a dairy. So he was using Chinese labor to tunnel through that basalt hill. We're really pretty sure he didn't get all the way through before he decided to sell out to Leland Stanford, but we have a lot of Chinese artifacts mixed in with the Murphy trash. So disentangling what's the Murphys and what's the Chinese laborers digging the tunnel is going to take a little bit of work that we're still doing today. So what's next? We're still working on Camp Fremont, and we're still looking at trenches, trying to find the tunnels at Slack. We're still working really hard on Camp Fremont. We're going to go back to the branch jail and the quarry and try to see whether we can find more what we call in archaeology features. Artifacts is what we'd really like to have associated with that jail. We'd like to locate more of the mystery buildings. After the Stanfords bought the property, they leased back to the Murphys some buildings that were on the Coots and Lieb properties. And so it appears as if the Murphys had built buildings, perhaps with permission from either Coots or Lieb, that were not on their property. And then Jane Stanford leased those properties back to them. So we're really looking hard for those buildings because there will be additional archaeological ruins associated with them. One of these is the goat area that someone was talking about earlier. And we're also looking now for the ruins and remains associated with the Azevedo Ranch dairy. I ran out of time last year for finding this. Azevedo Ranch dairy, it's I think it's a 1917 map over on the right side, and then a grainy 1933 aerial photo on the other side. Several hundred cows, family from the Azores who ran this dairy, with a lot of other people from the Azores working as milkers in this dairy. We did find a stock tank associated with the dairy. What you'll notice about the dairy, it was closed in 1944, but the widening and realignment of Page Mill Road in 1965 went right through the barns of that dairy. I mean, completely wiped out the center of that dairy. But there are some buildings on the hill above the road where we may still find material. That's where we found the stock tank. Just yesterday, I found the livestock auction for that dairy. They were selling several hundred cows in 1944. So our next step, really, we're back into the archival research, which during the winter, we tend to do archival research and artifact analysis in the lab. And then in the spring, we'll be back out in the field to do more surface reconnaissance. And then we may, in fact, do some excavating later in the spring or summer at Azevedo Ranch. I am finished almost on time, so I can give you this last story. True crime romance. It's unbelievable how many crazy things have happened on Old Page Mill Road. And I particularly liked this story, the petting party bandit. Kidnapped a Stanford junior student and his girl. And you'll see it, the Delta Chi fraternity member was parked on Page Mill Road with his companion when a large black car drove up. One man leaped from the bandit car and thrust a pistol at him, ordered him to start his motor and drive up the road. He refused. He got pistol whipped for refusing. The thug climbed into the seat beside the girl and ordered him to drive. They drive up Old Page Mill Road a ways. The bandit orders him to stop, throws the ignition key out of the car, steps out and demands his money, but the car hadn't stopped running. So they went on, Harding and the girl speed off up Old Page Mill Road, chased by the bandits, and managed to flee, elude and outdistance them. And I have to say that Mr. Harding declined to name his girl companion, who certainly in 1931 would have been in a lot of trouble at Stanford for being out after curfew. I can't even tell you how many crazy stories there are. And some of the romance artifacts we found up on Old Page Mill Road, recent and ancient. Lots of buttons for some reason. We could talk more about that later. So I've saved a lot of time for questions. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to page back up if there's a map or a slide you want to take a look at. This is my favorite part of the talk, which is where you tell me something I don't know already, which would be terrific, or I'm able to answer a question that I didn't cover. So there at the back.
Can we access your maps and part of your show here in any way? You mentioned one thing was on Stanford Geological.
Let me see, I think I can probably post it on the Stanford Historical Society Facebook page, I think. So let me see what I can do about that, and have somebody let you know how you can get a hold of it. Because none of it's copyrighted, so I should be able to do that. There's one more in the back, and then I'll move to the front row. Yes?
Laura, how many of these sites are accessible to the public? Can we walk up and see any of these things?
How many of these sites are accessible to the public? Well, some of them are easy to see as you're walking along Old Page Mill Road. So I got an email this morning from Lauren Conway, who works for me, and she said, don't get upset, but there was a car wreck, and a car drove through the fence at the jail site. And so I, of course, drove by there today, and if it's on the end closest to Foothill Boulevard, you'll notice that the big black chain link fence on the Stanford Dish side, I don't even know how fast they were going because it is completely mutilated, and there's a steel fence in front of it. That is the branch jail site. We fill in the holes in the winter when we're not working. So you're just going to be staring at some weeds and some oak trees, but that is the jail site, and the quarry is across the creek behind it, sometimes known as the Boneyard Quarry, where Stanford stores its old sandstone blocks. That's where that jail is. And then as you're walking up the road towards 280, as I said, when you get to Frenchman's Tower, you're at that intersection of the Murphys, the Coots, and Lieb. And so the Murphys actually lived kind of up the hill where some of those newer houses are. And they threw their trash in a field there on the side of the road, and some of it into the creek near the tower. So it's really those two ends of Page Mill Road. You can't get to the World War II trenches. That is a very long, steep climb through some poison oak to get to. You have to climb 3 fences. So I doubt you can get there, but you can gaze upon the site of the jail and go up and see when you're looking at that tower and thinking about what was Peter Coots doing, because we all wonder. And really, did he really tunnel through that hill over there? By the way, we did use remote sensing to try to find those tunnels. And the remote sensing guys told us they think they're too deep. right? They're not able, remote sensing can't go more than 6 to 8 feet deep, can't see deep enough to necessarily see those tunnels. So we had some more questions up here, yes?
Do you know the origin of the tunnel that's in the quarry on the face of the cliff?
The tunnel in the quarry, that's a different quarry than the one we're talking about. It's the upper quarry. And we're pretty sure that the tunnel in that quarry is just quarrying, checking, to see how much farther the basalt deposit goes. Those quarries were closed in the 1950s by Stanford, a Stanford business manager, Alf Brandon, who described them as a nuisance. They had been leased to other quarrying companies, and the dust and noise as the communities around it started to build houses in Los Altos Hills and the Stanford faculty housing got closer, the noise from the quarry and the dust were pretty awful. Wallace Stegner called them a desecration. And so they were closed in the 1950s. And part of the reason, and this may be part of why they were tunneling, is that as they got further back into the deposit, the rock got more and more brittle, and they were getting cave-ins in the quarry wall, which is why those quarries are fenced and nobody should be up there looking at the caves. But that's where that particular cave is located. Yes, sir?
Where can I read more about the Arastadero murder?
Oh, the Arastadero murder. What? Yes. He wants to know where he can read more about the Arastadero murder. I was telling a couple people that I voraciously read online historic newspapers. And so there's a service called newspapers.com, which is historic newspapers. And I was looking for records about the Arastadero dairy, a different dairy that's on Stanford land. And I came across this story from the pioneer days, 1850s, 1860s, that there was a neighbor dispute about a fence out there somewhere. And somebody got shot. And they went to court. I don't believe the first gentleman dies. They go down to court in St. James Square in San Jose, and and all the neighbors go down there to testify about this fence dispute, and they have a loud argument in front of the courthouse, and one of these gentlemen, who was not involved in the first dispute, shoots one of his neighbors and kills him, and is in fact sentenced to death and hanged. All right, so his widow pays her lawyer in land. That's how Lieb got the land, was that he was the lawyer for the widow. And so I'm not sure that this story is written anywhere, but I was just amazed. If you imagine that beautiful courthouse down in San Jose and that square in front of it, and they're having this fight out in front of the courthouse, and you just pull out your pistol and shoot somebody.
What date, roughly?
This would be in the 1860s. And so Lieb, like a lot of other people, lawyers in this time period, would take land. I believe the gentleman who he took this land from was Crowley, would take land in lieu of payment. And so Lieb got it and sold it to Leland Stanford much later. Don?
Yes, you said that Frenchman's Tower is the corner of the Coots land.
Yes.
Was there any other purpose or reason for his building that?
Oh, geez, now the Frenchman's Tower. As the corner of Coots land, was there any other reason for it? My theory, and as you can see I am often wrong, is that it was a water tank, right? There are timbers in the top of it, big timbers, big redwood timbers, and so that he was pumping water up there. Maybe a windmill, I'm not sure, but that he was, like all tank houses, you have to have a pump to get it up there, right? So I think it's a tank house, and he's either watering livestock with it, or it's part of his waterwork hydraulic system that's going to feed water into the tunnels. So I think it's part of his water project. Now, there are other theories out there, but that's my personal favorite theory. But as I said, I'm wrong about half the time. Yes, sir?
Is there a window in the side of the tower, or is that just a decoration?
Is there a window in the side of the tower? There are openings in the tower. I don't believe they ever held glass. It's very romantic, kind of Norman tower. And it did have an opening, a door opening, that was bricked up later. Yes, Chris?
Are there names or demographics about the occupants of the branch jail that have been preserved in records?
Chris wants to know about the occupants of the branch jail and whether there are records about that. What we did find, which was interesting, is that there's some state document, like a Bureau of Prisons kind of annual report, but the only thing it told you is how many people were in each jail. So it'll tell you how many people are in the branch jail in various years, which is useful. But I would imagine that we'd probably have to look at court records to see what people were actually sentenced there. It's a good question. And if we can actually find some artifacts associated with these prisoners, I think we would go to the effort of trying to learn more about who they might have been. Although, it's the kind of thing, it's very interesting history. It's not clear to me how, whether or not the descendants of people who went to prison, how proud they are about that. But it's a long time ago, and if you told me that one of my ancestors had been a horse thief and worked in the branch jail picking rock, I'd be fascinated. So we might find some people who know more about that. Yes, ma'am?
Why was there dirt on the jail? Did people just throw dirt on the buildings?
Yeah, why is the dirt on the jail? Why the jail was so hard to find is that this is just another one of those things about Old Page Mill Road, an enormous amount of illegal dumping. It still goes on out there, where people don't want to pay to dispose of their material at the landfill, so they go up to this deserted little road and shove it out of the back of the truck. So we found an astonishing array, almost 3 feet of junk on top of that jail. It was really pretty shocking. It still goes on today. Yes, Beth?
First of all, I want to ask how many people in this room know Tom Wyman? Tom was a long time member of PAHA and president, and also wrote a good bit for the Stanford Historical Association. And he talked about, as a boy, ranging through those hills, and he picked up shells and things of that kind, and did discover some of what he thought might be tunnels. Did he ever write anything for the Stanford Historical Association about that?
No, I don't think he did. And it's a shame, because I would like to know more about it. It does remind me, there's a new book about Camp Fremont. Barbara Wilcox just came out last year.
Yes. Fascinating
read. And when she presented it to the Stanford Historical Society, and as president, I was standing in the back of the room watching people come in, and and getting ready at the end of her talk to help people leave, and this gentleman stood up and he had a tank shell with him. And I thought I was going to have to pull the fire alarm, So what are you doing? And he had the fire department disarm it. Lives up near the Palo Alto golf course, and had found it in his yard. But when he pulled it out of his bag, I really did think I was going to have to pull the fire alarm. Some of that is really dangerous, right? So if you have a really big tank artillery shell casing in your yard, you're just supposed to call 911 and not dig it up with a shovel and carry it around. They find them in Foothill Park. They find them up in near the golf course. We have not found any at Stanford that I know of, but they're shooting from Stanford out into the hills. So, okay, they've got some more people back here. Yes.
What's next for Alan and his interest in the frogs in Matadero Creek?
It's a very good question about what's next for the frogs in Matadero Creek. We're going to do some additional work because the biologists are a little concerned by the amount of lead we're finding. So we're about to do, even though the lead from these bullets doesn't Bullets are really hard. It's not like flakes of lead paint that sort of distribute lead dust around. The lead is not supposed to move very far in the soil and water, but they're sufficiently concerned about it that we're doing a joint project together to sample some, particularly the gun club areas, to find out what we need to do to clean that up, because we'd prefer not to be building beautiful nature ponds for this endangered species in soil that might have lead in it. So that's the next thing we're going to do, is try to find a way to quantify what that is, how deep it goes, and what it would take to clean it up. So it's a good question. We were sort of hoping that it was all the Army and we could make them pay for it. But it turns out that all kinds of people have been out there doing that, so it's almost certainly Stanford's going to have to bear that on their own. Yes, ma'am, in the back?
Does your department only excavate Stanford land, or do you do any of the surrounding area?
Does my department only excavate Stanford land? And the answer is yes. We have over 100 archaeological sites at Stanford. It is more than enough to keep us busy. But there are a lot of other archaeologists in the area. Foothill College has archaeologists. San Jose State has archaeologists. I know that Foothill College has been working with MidPen. I did a little bit of pro bono work for MidPen as well on recording sites in the open space preserves. So there are other archaeologists out there working in the area as well. There's another question over here. Yes, sir?
In 1942 or 43, when I was 7 or 8, my mother and my parents rented a house on the Stanford campus, faculty house, that just overlooked Foothill on Serra. And the thing that fascinated me as a boy, in my bedroom, I would open the curtains in the morning and there would be soldiers marching along, a convoy. There were jeeps, and I believe they had artillery behind them. They were marching south on the road, and I always wondered where they were going and where they were coming from. I now have a handle on where they were going. They were going to this
It was called the Page Mill Camp.
And where were they bivouacked? Where did they come from?
Well, there were soldiers bivouacked at the Page Mill Camp. I also found a reference that I haven't been able to track down yet to Camp Alto, which I...
They would go in the morning and come back in the evening, so they weren't bivouacked.
Right. So the other thing that it may be is that Stanford also had Army specialized training during World War II, and a very large number of soldiers on campus. And we know they did some joint maneuvers at the Page Mill Camp and the rifle range. So it's possible that they were soldiers who were bivouacked at Stanford, it's also a very active ROTC program at Stanford in the time period, who were going out to do something with the soldiers at the Page Mill Camp. That's just a guess.
By getting a parade twice a day.
Yep. It's really amazing, that picture of the rifleman running up the hill. There's also a picture of the trumpeter and the tuba player who had sounded the charge for them to run up the hill. Those were different times. Yes, ma'am?
Where was your work with the Indians?
My work with the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, I've worked very closely with them on campus since the 1980s. I first met them when we were doing our archaeological work at Stanford West, where we were able to preserve 5 ancient Ohlone sites in a 11-acre conservation easement and build the apartments without damaging those sites. So I met them at Stanford West in the 1980s. I have done work with them on other sites in the Bay Area, as well as on Stanford land. And consider them very good friends, both of the university and myself personally. It's been very gratifying to me to be able to work with tribal members. And in fact, now I sometimes work with young Ohlone students whose grandparents worked with me. As we get more historic, we can get to see that in our own lifetimes. It's terrific. Way back in the corner, yes?
Where does the name Frenchman's Tower come from, and are there any other theories as to why it was built besides what you mentioned?
So the name Frenchman's Tower comes from the gentleman who built it, Peter Coutts, who was had another name as well, Jean-Paul Baptiste de Caperon, and he was from France. And so all of the things he built and left behind are popularly referred to as Frenchmen. So we have Frenchman's Lake, or Frenchman's Road, Frenchman's Tower, the Frenchman's Library, or sometimes called Tower House. So it's simply the fact that this gentleman who built them in the late 1860s, early 1870s was from France. So there is a person called the Frenchman, and if you're on Peter Coutts Road, that's also the Frenchman. Yes, ma'am?
Wasn't the road named, wasn't that the road that they brought lumber down and took it to Mayfield, and then the train took it to San Francisco? Wasn't that the case? And would you find things to do with lumbering particularly as a big feature of your research?
Yeah, she's asking about Page Mill Road, which was the road to Page's Mill. And Page's Mill was over in Santa Cruz County, near Peters Creek, near Big Basin. So it was all the way over on the other side of the summit. And Mr. Page built a road to bring his lumber to Palo Alto, or to Mayfield at the time. He owned, I believe, a lumber store or company in Palo Alto. And although at the time it was more common to put the lumber on barges and to tow it up the bay, than to put it on the train. But you are absolutely right. Page Mill Road is the road to Page's Mill, and is in fact a really old road. I was doing some reading about it. This is a trivial point. I live on Page Mill Road, so I'm fascinated by it. And I was doing some reading about it, and I was also fascinated with this, what they're doing about paving the roads and the quarrying. And somebody was complaining in 1875. Long after Page's Mill had closed, that you couldn't, that when you would drive from Mayfield up Page Mill Road, that you had to cross a bunch of fences, that people had put stock fences across the road. And so it was really hard to get up to Skyline on the road. And I did find that it was improved in 1922, and the fences were removed, and it was reestablished as a road to Skyline. It was not reestablished on the other side. And then it was paved with rock in 1936. So it's a very old road, Page's Mill Road. And Page is a very interesting Mayfield pioneer. I wish I knew more about him, but there is some information. People have written actually about Page, so there is some information available out there. How about one more?
What did you say that road was built?
The road was actually, I think, built in the late 1850s, early 1860s.
These were cars.
No. They were wagons.
Right.
Yes, oxen dragging redwood logs. Yeah, and no. And your other part of the question, we didn't find anything associated with logging. The other thing we were really interested in, though, this is sort of a diversion, and I'm not sure I'm done answering this question yet, is that matadero in Spanish means a slaughtering place, right? And it's also the intersection of these three Mexican-era ranchos. And so we were really interested in, and the ranchos ran on the hide and tallow trade, right? So they ran all these cows, and it wasn't really about meat. It was about leather. They would export the hides back to Spain to make leather goods, and tallow for candles. And so we were really very interested in seeing whether we could see any evidence for hide and tallow trade slaughter areas, which there are a number of have been recorded in California archaeologically. We haven't found that yet. But if you can imagine, it is the kind of thing that you might go to the corner of your property right next to your neighbor's fence, just like the Murphys were doing, right? And throw away all this cow stuff you didn't want. But we haven't quite found that yet, but I have to say I've been so surprised. You know, when you drive along up there on Old Page Mill Road or take a walk, it seems just sort of pristine and natural, and like it's just this corner that time forgot. And then underneath the surface is all this seething history. And I don't think we've even begun to understand all its secrets. So I'll be around afterwards if you've got more questions, and thank you very much for having me.